Philadelphia, 1851. The needle slipped, pricking Sarah's finger for the third time that morning. She watched a bead of blood well up, bright red against her dark skin, and pressed it against her apron before it could stain the white linen she was hemming. Mrs. Henderson's tablecloth. Due by Friday. Sarah had 7 more to finish. She sat in the front room of the boarding house on Lombard Street, where the light was best for close work. Outside, Philadelphia moved through its Tuesday rhythms. Vendors calling their wares, carriages clattering over cobblestones, the distant clang of the shipyard bells marking the hour. Free sounds, free movement. Sarah had been free for 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. She still counted. "You're bleeding on the good fabric," came a voice from the doorway. Sarah looked up to see Grace Williams standing there, arms crossed, one eyebrow raised in that expression that managed to convey both disapproval and affection. Grace owned the boarding house, had owned it for almost 20 years, and in that time had given temporary homes to hundreds of people like Sarah, people who had arrived in Philadelphia with nothing but the clothes they wore and the weight of everything they'd left behind. "It's my finger, not the cloth," Sarah said, but she checked anyway. "Clean." She exhaled. Grace moved into the room, her skirts rustling. She was perhaps 50, her hair almost entirely gray now, pulled back in a severe bun that softened somehow when you saw her face. She had escaped from Virginia in 1831, had walked most of the way to Pennsylvania with her 2 young sons, one of whom had died of fever before they reached the border. The other, Michael, now worked as a waiter in one of the better hotels that served colored patrons and visited his mother every Sunday without fail. "There's a girl downstairs," Grace said quietly. "Arrived last night with Jonas. Barely conscious. Fever, I think, or exhaustion, or both." Sarah set down her sewing. This was part of life at Grace's boarding house. The steady stream of arrivals, some planned, many not, all of them carrying stories that weighed more than any physical burden. "Does she need?" "She needs everything," Grace interrupted. "Food, rest, clothes, papers eventually. But mostly she needs to see that it's possible. That life continues after. After. That word contained universes. After escape. After slavery. After everything you knew and everyone you loved disappeared behind you like smoke." "I'll sit with her," Sarah offered. Grace nodded. "I thought you might. But finish that tablecloth first. Mrs. Henderson pays promptly, and we need the money." This was another truth of freedom that Sarah had learned. It cost money. Everything cost money. The room she rented cost money. The food she ate cost money. The fabric she sewed, and the needle she used, and a lamp oil that let her work after dark. All of it required coins that she earned through endless hours of labor that was technically hers to sell, but practically felt as consuming as the work she'd done in bondage. The difference, she reminded herself daily, was that now she kept what she earned, could save it, could spend it as she chose, could walk away from employment that treated her poorly and seek something better. These were freedoms, real ones, even if they came wrapped in exhaustion and financial precarity. She worked until the light began to fade, finishing not just Mrs. Henderson's tablecloth, but 2 more besides, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision that came from years of practice. She had learned to sew in the big house on the Thornton plantation in Maryland, had spent her childhood hemming sheets and mending shirts for a family that had owned her mother and her grandmother before her. Master Thornton had fancied himself a benevolent slaveholder, which meant he only used the whip occasionally and allowed his slaves to keep small gardens and sometimes even earn a few coins for extra work. Sarah had believed him kind until the day he sold her mother south to cover gambling debts, tearing apart the only family Sarah had ever known without a second thought, with less consideration than he gave to selling a horse. That was when she began planning her escape, though it took 3 more years before the opportunity came and she found the courage to take it. When she finally set aside her work and went downstairs to the small room behind the kitchen where Grace housed new arrivals, she found a girl who might have been 18 or might have been 14. Slavery-age people in ways that made such determinations difficult. She was thin to the point of emaciation, her cheekbones sharp against her skin, her breathing shallow and rapid even in sleep. Sarah pulled a chair close to the narrow bed and sat down, studying the girl's face. There was a scar across her left eyebrow. The white line of old tissue that suggested violence survived. Her hands, resting on top of the blanket, were calloused and bore fresh wounds that looked like rope burns. "Her name is Ruth," Grace said from the doorway, her voice barely above a whisper. "From Alabama. Walked most of the way. Jonas found her collapsed by the roadside in Delaware and brought her the rest of the way in his wagon. Family." Grace shook her head. "Mother died when she was young. Father sold away when she was 12. No siblings that she knows of. She ran because her master was planning to breed her," his words, according to Jonas, "to one of the field hands, and she decided she'd rather die than bring a child into that life." Sarah felt the familiar tightness in her chest, the rage that never quite went away no matter how long she'd been free. The casual brutality of it, the way enslaved people were treated as livestock to be bred for profit, the absolute disregard for their humanity or their choices. How long ago did she arrive? 20 hours, give or take. She's barely woken. I've gotten some water into her and a bit of broth, but she needs real food and real rest. Grace paused. She needs to believe she's going to survive this. That was the hardest part, Sarah had learned. Not the physical journey north, though that was difficult enough. Not even the constant fear of being caught and returned. It was the afterward, when you had to figure out how to live with freedom, how to build a life from nothing, how to carry the weight of everyone you'd left behind. Ruth woke near midnight, her eyes opening suddenly, her body tensing as if preparing to flee. Sarah, who had been dozing in the chair, straightened immediately. "You're safe," she said quietly. "You're in Philadelphia. You're free." Ruth's eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the closed door, Sarah's face. "Where?" "Grace Williams' boarding house. On Lombard Street. Do you remember Jonas? He brought you here." Something relaxed in Ruth's expression, some fundamental terror easing. "Jonas." "Yes. He saved me. I couldn't walk anymore. I thought I was going to die." "But you didn't," Sarah said gently. "You made it. You're here now." Ruth tried to sit up and immediately fell back, her strength insufficient for even that simple movement. Sarah poured water from the pitcher on the nightstand and held the cup to Ruth's lips, supporting her head while she drank. "Slow," Sarah cautioned. "You'll make yourself sick." Ruth drank anyway, desperately, and Sarah understood. She remembered her own first days in Philadelphia, the way she devoured every piece of food offered to her, unable to trust that there would be more, unable to believe that she wouldn't wake up back in Maryland with the whole escape revealed as nothing but a cruel dream. "How long have you been here?" Ruth asked when she'd finished the water. "Free, I mean." 3 years, Sarah said. 2 months. 16 days. "You count." "I count." Ruth closed her eyes. "Does it get easier?" The counting. Sarah considered lying, offering false comfort. But Grace had taught her that newly free people needed truth more than comfort, needed to know what they were facing so they could prepare for it. "No," she said, "but it changes. At first you count because you can't believe it's real. Then you count because you're waiting for something terrible to happen. Eventually you count because you want to remember. Because every day free is a day that matters." Ruth was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was barely audible. "I left my father behind. He's still there. He might already be dead. He was sick when I ran, and Master doesn't spend money on doctors for slaves who can't work. But if he's alive, he's wondering where I went. Wondering if I'm dead or if I abandoned him." "You didn't abandon him," Sarah said firmly. "You survived. That's not abandonment. That's what he would have wanted for you. You don't know that. I do. Because that's what every parent wants for their child, enslaved or free. They want you to live. They want you to have the chance they didn't have." Sarah thought about her own mother, sold away 10 years ago now, who could be anywhere or nowhere, alive or dead, and who Sarah would probably never see again. The not knowing was its own form of torture, worse in some ways than confirmed death, because it left room for hope and guilt to coexist in equal measure. Ruth slept again, and Sarah returned to her chair, keeping watch through the night. This, too, was part of the unspoken community of formerly enslaved people in Philadelphia. You watched over the new arrivals because someone had watched over you, because you understood the terror of waking in a strange place and needing to see a familiar face, even if that face had only become familiar hours earlier. In the morning, Grace brought breakfast, bread and butter and eggs and tea, more food than Ruth had probably seen in a week. Ruth ate slowly, methodically, with the focused concentration of someone who had known real hunger. "We need to talk about what happens next," Grace said, settling into the second chair that Sarah had pulled into the room. "You can stay here as long as you need to recover your strength. A week, 2 weeks, if necessary. But eventually you'll need to support yourself, which means finding work." Ruth nodded, still chewing. "Can you read?" Grace asked. Ruth shook her head. "So, another shake. Cook, clean, launder." "I worked in the fields," Ruth said quietly. "Cotton. That's all I know." Grace and Sarah exchanged glances. Field work was hard to find in Philadelphia, and what existed was usually claimed by freeborn black men who had connections and experience. Women's work tended toward domestic service, cleaning, cooking, laundry, childcare, or skilled labor like sewing if you had the training. "We'll teach you," Sarah said. "I can show you basic sewing. Grace can teach you cooking and household management. It won't be what you knew, but you'll learn. And in the meantime," Grace added, "you work here, helping with the house, preparing rooms for other arrivals, assisting in the kitchen. You work for your room and board until you're strong enough and skilled enough to find paid employment." This was Grace's system, tested over years and hundreds of people. Give them immediate purpose and structure. Don't let them drown in the overwhelming nature of freedom. Keep them busy and useful while they healed and learned and figure out how to be people instead of property. Ruth stayed at the boarding house for 3 weeks. Sarah watched her transform slowly from the half-dead girl who had arrived, unable to stand, to someone who could walk without assistance, who could hem a straight line and prepare a simple meal and laugh at Grace's dry observations about the world. But Sarah also watched Ruth struggle with things that freeborn people took for granted. Simple decisions paralyzed her. What dress to wear, what food to choose when options were offered, where to sit in a room. Years of having every choice made for her had left her uncertain about her own preferences, unsure if she even had the right to have preferences. It's the small things that are hardest, Ruth confessed one evening while they worked together on mending. Big things, escaping, surviving the journey, getting here, those made sense. "I knew what I had to do, but now, I don't know how to just be, how to exist without someone telling me what to do every moment." Sarah understood. She still sometimes woke in the morning and felt panic at not having a master's schedule dictating her day, at having to decide for herself how to spend her hours. Freedom meant responsibility, and responsibility was exhausting when you'd never been allowed to practice it. "Start small," she advised. "Make one choice a day that's just yours. What you eat for breakfast, which dress you wear, where you sit. Practice choosing until it feels natural instead of terrifying." Did it work for you? Sarah thought about her own 3 years of freedom, about the way she had slowly built an identity separate from her bondage. "It's working. I'm not finished yet, but it's working." The hardest conversation came on a Sunday afternoon, when Grace gathered Ruth and the 3 other residents of the boarding house, all formerly enslaved people at various stages of adjustment, to talk about papers. "You need free papers," Grace explained. "Documents that prove your status as a free person. Without them, you're vulnerable. Any slave catcher can claim you're a runaway from their district, and you have no legal standing to dispute it." "But I'm a runaway," Ruth said, confused. "Yes, but we don't admit that. Legally, you're claiming to have always been free. You need papers that say so, papers that will hold up if you're questioned." "How do I get papers if I wasn't free?" "We forge them," Grace said bluntly. "There's a man in the community who produces excellent documents. They're not cheap. Cost is $5, but they're necessary. Without them, you're not really free. You're just escaped. $5. Sarah watched Ruth's face fall at the figure. It might as well have been 500. Ruth had no money, no way to earn money until she had skills that could be sold, no way to get skills without time that she couldn't afford because she needed money. It was a trap, one that caught many newly free people. You needed papers to work safely, but you needed to work to afford papers. The solution was often debt, borrowing money against future wages. But debt felt too much like bondage, and many people couldn't bring themselves to accept it even when it was their best option. "I'll lend you the money," Sarah heard herself say. "You can pay me back when you find work." Ruth stared at her. "Why would you do that? You don't even know me." "Someone lent me money for my papers," Sarah said. It had been Grace, actually, who had fronted the cost for 3 different people that first year Sarah had lived at the boarding house, and who had never asked for repayment from any of them. "This is how it works. We help each other because we understand what it costs to get here." Ruth cried then, silently, tears streaming down her face while she tried to maintain composure. Sarah remembered that too. The overwhelming weight of kindness after a lifetime of cruelty, the way generosity could break you open when violence had only made you harder. The forged papers identified Ruth as having been born free in Pennsylvania, daughter of free parents, with documentation of her birth in Philadelphia in 1833. The dates were deliberately vague, the signatures illegible enough to be plausible but not verifiable. The man who made them, whom Sarah never met and whose name was never spoken, was an artist of deception, creating documents that could withstand casual inspection and sometimes even serious scrutiny. With papers in hand, Ruth's prospects improved. Grace arranged for her to work as a day laundress for several families, work that required strength but not extensive training. The pay was terrible, 50 cents for a full day's labor that left her exhausted and aching. But it was money that was hers, wages for work she had agreed to do and could walk away from if the conditions became intolerable. Sarah watched Ruth navigate this new reality, saw her struggle with the mathematics of survival. How to make 50 cents stretch to cover food and lodging and clothing and the endless small expenses of daily life. How to save money when there was never quite enough for immediate needs. How to balance the desperate desire to send money back south to buy family members' freedom with the practical impossibility of accumulating enough for such purchases. "It's not enough," Ruth said one evening, sitting at the kitchen table where Sarah was teaching her more advanced sewing techniques. "I work myself to exhaustion every day, and I can barely afford to eat. How is this freedom? I'm still working for almost nothing, still at the mercy of white people who don't see me as fully human." It was a fair question, one that Sarah had asked herself countless times. The answer was complicated and unsatisfying. "You can leave," Sarah said quietly. "That's the difference. If your employer treats you poorly, you can walk away and find different work. If you want to move to a different city, you can. If you decide you want to learn a trade or start a business or do anything else, no one can stop you. The freedom isn't in the work itself. Work is still work. The freedom is in the choice." "But the choices are all terrible," Ruth protested. "I can choose between barely surviving here or going back into bondage. That's not really a choice." "No," Sarah agreed. "It's not, but it's more than we had before, and it's a foundation we can build on. Every day we're free is a day we're not enslaved. Every skill we learn, every connection we make, every dollar we save, it's all building towards something better. Not perfect, maybe not even good, but better." Ruth was quiet for a long moment, her fingers working the needle through fabric. "Do you ever regret it? Escaping? Because sometimes I think about my father still in Alabama, and I wonder if I made the right choice. If I should have stayed and taken care of him instead of running." Sarah set down her own sewing and looked at Ruth directly. "I regret that the world is such that we had to make those choices. I regret that our options were bondage or escape with nothing in between. I regret every person I left behind and every person who couldn't or didn't make it north. But do I regret being free? No, never. Not even on the hardest days." Over the following months, Sarah watched Ruth slowly, painfully build a life. She moved out of Grace's boarding house into a tiny room she shared with another woman, cutting her expenses in half. She learned to sew well enough to take on piece work in the evenings, supplementing her laundry wages. She made friends in the community, found a church that welcomed her, began to construct a network of support and connection. She also began attending the informal school that met in the basement of the church on Sunday afternoons, where volunteers taught reading and writing to formerly enslaved people who had been denied education. Sarah sometimes helped with the teaching, passing along the skills that she had learned in bondage through patient observation and dangerous secret practice. Watching Ruth struggle with letters and words, seeing her frustration at how slowly the learning came, Sarah was reminded of her own education. Stolen moments with a primer hidden beneath her palette, the terror of being caught with the forbidden knowledge of literacy. Learning to read had been her first act of resistance, her first assertion that she was more than property. Now she could pass that gift to others openly, legally, without fear. But if the days were about building and learning and slowly constructing new identities as free people, the nights were haunted. Sarah often woke to the sound of Ruth crying in her sleep or screaming from nightmares about being caught and returned south. Grace said this was normal, that everyone who escaped carried the weight of what they'd left behind and the fear of what might still be coming. Sarah had her own nightmares, dreams where she was back on the Thornton plantation, back in bondage, and the 3 years of freedom were revealed as an elaborate fantasy. She would wake gasping, her heart racing, and need long minutes to convince herself that the small room with its simple furniture was real, that Philadelphia was real, that she was truly free. The fear of being caught was not irrational. The Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 had made it legal, required, even, for free state authorities to assist in the capture and return of escaped slaves. There were professional slave catchers in Philadelphia, men who made their living hunting down runaways and returning them south for bounties. No formerly enslaved person was truly safe, no matter how long they'd been in the North or how legitimate their papers appeared. This reality came crashing home one evening in the summer of 1852, when Sarah was walking home from delivering finished sewing to a client. She was crossing a busy street, her mind occupied with mental calculations of the money she'd earned and what it would cover, when she heard a voice that froze her blood. Sarah? Sarah Hamilton. She knew before she turned that it was Master Thornton's son, James, who had been 15 when she escaped and was now apparently 18 and in Philadelphia for reasons she didn't want to know. He stood on the corner, his face registering shock and then something uglier, calculation. Sarah didn't wait to hear what he would say next. She ran. She ran through streets she knew better than he did, dodging into alleys and cutting through yards, her heart hammering with a terror she thought she'd left behind. She could hear him following, shouting for someone to stop her, claiming she was a runaway slave from his father's property in Maryland. Several people on the street looked at her with suspicion, but no one tried to stop her. The black community of Philadelphia had an unspoken agreement. You didn't help slave catchers, you didn't interfere with people trying to escape. White bystanders were more mixed in their responses, some looking away deliberately, others seeming uncertain about whether to intervene. Sarah made it back to Grace's boarding house and burst through the door, gasping for breath. Grace took one look at her face and immediately understood. Who saw you? Master Thornton's son, James. He recognized me. He tried to follow me. Grace moved with the decisive efficiency of someone who had dealt with this situation before. Upstairs. Get Ruth and anyone else who's here. You're all leaving. Now. Leaving? Where? There's a safe house outside the city. A farm run by Quakers who help when situations like this arise. I'll send word to Jonas. He'll get you there tonight. But you cannot stay here. If that boy goes to the authorities, they'll come searching, and anyone in this house could be arrested. Sarah felt her carefully constructed life crumbling. 3 years of work, of building skills and connections, and a sense of security, all destroyed in an instant because someone from her past had seen her face. Grace seemed to read her thoughts. This isn't the end, she said firmly. It's a setback. You leave the city for a while, let things settle. Maybe you come back. Maybe you move somewhere else. But you're still free, Sarah. He saw you, but he didn't catch you. That matters. By nightfall, Sarah, Ruth, and 2 other residents of the boarding house were hidden in Jonas's wagon, being transported to a farm 20 miles outside Philadelphia. Sarah watched the city disappear behind them and felt the weight of loss settling over her. The room she'd rented, the clients she'd cultivated, the church community and the Sunday school, and the small routines that had made her feel like a person with a life instead of a runaway with a history. The farm was run by a couple named Jacob and Hannah Miller, Quakers in their 60s who had been sheltering fugitives for 30 years. They welcomed the new arrivals with quiet efficiency, showing them to a barn where a concealed room had been built specifically for situations like this. "Thee will be safe here," Hannah said in the formal Quaker manner of speech. "We have never lost a guest to the slave catchers, and we do not intend to start now." Sarah spent 3 weeks on the farm, working alongside Ruth and the others to earn their keep, cooking, cleaning, helping with the harvest. It was good work, honest work, but it felt like going backward, like losing ground she'd fought hard to gain. "I hate this," she confessed to Ruth one evening as they sat shelling peas on the farmhouse porch. "I hate that one person can destroy everything just by seeing my face. I hate that I'm not safe even after 3 years. I hate that I'll never be safe, not really, not as long as slavery exists." Ruth was quiet for a moment, her hands working mechanically. "Grace told me something before we left," she finally said. "She said freedom isn't a destination. It's a direction. We're always moving toward it, but we might never fully arrive. And that has to be enough, because the alternative is to stop moving, to give up, and that's the same as going back." "That's not enough," Sarah said. "Moving toward freedom while never reaching it. That's just a different kind of torture." "Maybe," Ruth acknowledged, "but it's torture we chose. And we can choose again tomorrow and the day after that. We keep choosing freedom even when it's hard, even when it would be easier to give up. That's what makes us free." After 3 weeks, Jonas brought word that it was safe to return to Philadelphia. James Thornton had left the city, apparently not willing to pursue the matter further, and the immediate danger had passed. But Grace advised Sarah to be more careful, to vary her routes around the city, to consider changing her name and getting new papers that would make her harder to track. Sarah returned to Philadelphia, but found that her old life no longer fit quite right. Some of her clients had found other seamstresses during her absence. Her room had been rented to someone else. The sense of security she'd been building was gone, replaced by constant vigilance and the understanding that she would always be looking over her shoulder. But she also found unexpected sources of strength. The community that had formed around Grace's boarding house rallied to support her, offering temporary lodging and introducing her to new clients and helping her rebuild. Ruth, who Sarah had once helped, now returned the favor, sharing the room she rented and splitting expenses until Sarah could get back on her feet. This, too, was part of freedom, Sarah realized. Not the absence of struggle or danger, but the presence of choice and community. The ability to help and be helped, to form connections based on mutual support rather than enforce hierarchy. The opportunity to fail and try again without someone owning the results of her labor. Years passed. Sarah built a reputation as a skilled seamstress, eventually opening a small shop that employed 3 other women, all formerly enslaved. Ruth learned to read and write, became involved in the abolitionist movement, gave speeches at gatherings about her experiences in bondage and her journey to freedom. Grace continued to run her boarding house, sheltering new arrivals and teaching them how to navigate freedom. Jonas continued his dangerous work as a conductor on the Underground Railroad, making trip after trip south to guide people north. The community grew and evolved, shaped by each person who arrived and each person who stayed. Sarah never stopped counting the days since her escape, but the meaning of the counting changed. It became less about disbelief or fear and more about commemoration. Each day was a victory, a refusal to be defined by bondage, an assertion of her right to exist as a free person. She never saw anyone from the Thornton plantation again, never learned what happened to her mother or the other people she'd left behind. That not knowing remained painful, a wound that never fully healed, but that she learned to carry. She attended memorials for people who had died trying to escape, celebrated with people who successfully brought family members north, mourned the continuation of slavery in the South, while working to support its eventual end. When the Civil War began in 1861, Sarah was 37 years old and had been free for 13 years. She watched young men from Philadelphia's black community volunteer to fight, knowing that this war might finally end the institution that had stolen so much from so many. She donated what money she could to support the war effort, sewed uniforms and bandages, offered her shop as a meeting place for organizing relief efforts. And when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed in 1863, Sarah stood in the crowd outside Independence Hall and wept. Not because the proclamation solved everything, it didn't, left many enslaved people still in bondage, changed nothing about the racism that pervaded both North and South, but because it was a step, a movement in the direction of freedom, and after a lifetime of fighting for every inch of ground, she understood that steps mattered even when they were insufficient. Ruth stood beside her in that crowd, both of them older now, both of them bearing the marks of hard-lived lives, both of them still standing, still free, still fighting. Was it worth it? Ruth asked quietly. Everything we went through to get here? Sarah thought about the question, about the cost and the gain, about the life she'd built from nothing and the life she'd left behind. Yes, she said. Yes, it was worth it. Not because freedom is easy or perfect or even always good, but because we chose it. And that choice, that agency, that's everything. They stood together in the celebrating crowd, two women who had walked different paths from bondage to freedom, who had built lives despite every obstacle, who had learned that survival itself was a form of resistance, and that community was the foundation on which lasting change was built. The weight of freedom, Sarah had learned, was real and substantial. It was responsibility and choice and uncertainty and risk. It was making mistakes and living with consequences and building something from nothing. It was harder in many ways than the clear structure of bondage had been, because it required constant decision-making and self-definition in a world that still didn't see her as fully human. But it was hers. The weight was hers to carry. The choices were hers to make. The life was hers to build. And that made all the difference.